Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited that you made it here. We have two wonderful speakers, Tim Kobe and Roger Lehman, and they wrote this book, Return on Experience. If you can't see it in the Zoom, buy it and put it in your room. It's really excellent. We're going to start a conversation with Tim and Roger, who I'm happy to say are thought leaders, and also their thoughts are not so distinct from ours. They believe in the same thing. For now, let's call it leading as if life matters. They call it more returning on the value that companies produce by working for positive human outcomes. Welcome, Tim and Roger. So my canned question was, the best place to begin is probably with your book, which has 12 themes. That's quite a lot to talk about in under an hour. So Roger, Tim, which theme would you like to begin with, and lead our thoughts for them for a few moments?
Let's see. We could the best thing to do would be to start at the beginning. The book is really not necessarily designed as what to do and what not to do relative to design or business, but it's structured in such a way that we look at a conversation. We look at how design has been part of a conversation pretty much since its beginning, and probably will continue to be. And so, I guess, the first chapter we start to talk a bit about what is design and why design matters, and some of the fundamental beliefs that are built around the idea that it's really what informs and drives human progress, that we in the creative fields and in many areas of companies who are busy creating products and services for others have an obligation to fulfill a purpose that has a positive human outcome. And I think we go into a fair amount of detail in terms of the questions that are built around design, but it's probably not what most people think about when they think about design. It's not just the look and the feel, but it's what it does for people.
Yeah, and if I were to build on what Tim said, I think what's unique about the book is that Tim comes from it, obviously, from a design perspective and a long history of working in that field. And what I bring, because of my training as a psychoanalyst and an organizational psychologist, is to look at the factors that Tim is identifying and understanding below the surface at an individual and as well as at an organizational level, why that has the impact it has, or why it doesn't have the impact that it has. And so we begin to go between us in terms of looking at design, looking at customer experience, and then looking at what's happening below the surface to drive that experience in one way or the other.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Roger. I'm going to depart from my script a little bit here and go back to real life. You saw what happened in the movement between one room and the other that we had, and how it's just like, this is a world we're living in where we're not sure if we're going to be hacked, if we're not sure how secure our systems are, where we're consistently being asked to buy something, even though we know sometimes we're buying things at the expense of our very ability to continue on this planet. So when you talk about leadership and you talk about design, have you found ways that we can approach these challenges of let's not prey on each other, let's pray with each other for a progress that will actually make sense for people on a planet?
Yeah, I think we've been looking at this kind of condition, for quite a while. And one of the things that we talk about is, how do we create value? And we create value when other people believe that what it is you're doing is valuable. And so, one of the key things is it's not value in the sense of does it have monetary value per se. It's how do you create value that influences the best human outcomes. And when we talk about the best human outcomes, that also includes the planet, that includes the resources, that includes one another. But the companies that are, I think, the most successful at delivering on this value proposition are the ones who represent a value system that others can connect with. And we're starting to see it more and more, where people either support or they don't support companies or other individuals that that if they don't reflect the values they have, they're not going to really participate in supporting that direction. And so I think when we think of value creation, it's at a very broad level as well as at the individual level. And I think that if it's things that are exploitive, if it's things that aren't simple, honest, and relevant, it's typically going to struggle. And I think we have to just start to migrate the way that we think about design in such a way that those become the core attributes, because ultimately they have the long-term value. You see what's going on with Facebook, you see what's going on with other companies, and I think that the values that companies stand for start to define who they are, much in the same way it does ourselves as individuals.
And I think, Jim, Mary, if I just add to that, I think one of the fundamental issues that I think is often overlooked is, you don't get to decide whether you're adding value or not.
Yeah.
The system or the ecosystem or your customers or your employees who determine that. And it is, I think, a zero-sum game. So either you are adding value or you're destroying value. It may at times be infinitesimal. It may at other times be gigantic. And so being mindful of that, not what you think is adding value, but what are you picking up from the system, from below or underneath the surface, that would either confirm that this is adding value or not. And obviously, customer loyalty, customer experience is a wonderful measure for that, among many others.
I'm not in the habit of using my power of the podium to push back, so I hope this isn't perceived as of that. I'm looking at the audience for your conversation, for our conversation, and some of them will be hoping that what you're saying is true, that simple, honest, and relevant has found its moment, and that there is a market movement of employees and shareholders and people who really care to conform companies to practice that is consistent with viability. I mean, that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about being green or happy or anything else. It's just if we want a viable planet, if we want thriving communities, if we want more equity, we are simply going to have to transform practice. And yet I know, because I speak to them all the time, that when they go to interview with architectural firms, or when they go to interview with universities, or when they go to interview with, fates forbid, fashion, it's not always thinking about simple, honest, and relevant or viability. And yeah, I'm just going to hold that one as my statement and ask both of you, where's the clog? I mean, we meet well-meaning people all the time, and we meet really interesting people, and you are two of the most interesting people. Your values are clearly there, and they're quite clearly articulated. What's holding us back?
That's a good question.
My immediate response, Mary, is greed. The fact that there are a lot of competing commitments in people, and I think there are people who are willing to sacrifice the values for the immediate positive return in terms of the impact or the gain that they personally or even within their organization can gain. Ultimately, the nice thing is that ultimately, most often, eventually, it no longer works. But you can do a lot of damage before it no longer works.
I was paying attention to that ultimately, most often, and eventually. Yeah, and I was thinking about the gap in between. Yes. I mean, sooner or later, even the most desperate villains are often brought to their knees, but how many people are in the wake of that? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also, when you ask what's holding it back, I think part of it is the way that the system is designed. It's not necessarily designed to support human outcomes. Human outcomes. It's structured in such a way that I think the focus is very clearly skewed towards near-term gain, and until that structure is modified, I think it's problematic. The biggest thing, I think, though, is the fact that as human beings, we're more resistant to change maybe than we think we are. And what it takes is, I think designers have responsibilities to create change. That's the fundamental reason for design. All design is change. And whether you're a young practitioner or a more senior one, you need to take the responsibility to help make that change. And what's interesting is, we're probably trained in one of the few professions where change is kind of built in. We have a natural, I think, distinctive competitive advantage to deal with change. And that means having people who are change agents at all levels of businesses, that it means being dedicated to making things better in your practice. And I think what tends to happen is you get a tipping point, you get a critical mass of people who are believing that, and things change. I mean, we've seen it in the past. We've seen it with apartheid. We've seen it with all kinds of other things in the past. And we only have change when we have enough, change agents. There are enough people out there who are actively participating. And I think it doesn't mean it has to be a sort of a political thing. It has to be something where there's a dedication to the best human outcomes. And if we can demonstrate that positive human outcomes lead to positive business outcomes, then business will simply follow. Most business systems are somewhat mechanical in their behavior. And so I think that it's a question of setting those priorities and leading, and the companies who tend to lead end up getting a fair amount of the benefit, the market share, and that brings the laggards along with them. So I think it's important to recognize that we have an obligation to influence change in the design community.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Roger. I know that Maren is a little pressed for time, and she worked so hard to get us ready for this. I'm wondering, just to break with that mechanical system for a moment, Maren, do you have a question that you'd like to put to Roger and Tim?
Sure. My interest is in, I think, the real opportunity around experience design, and I'd like to hear your perspectives on this. Is when we're looking to design for change, most of the solutions are often very cerebral or very mechanized solutions, but we're not really tapping into the sort of emotive quality that really motivates people to change, sort of the hearts and minds to motivate the experience of people to motivate for change. And I'm wondering, I know it's a chapter in your book, but I'm wondering how you work with emotion in your design projects to really sort of catapult people into more of a change mindset.
Well, I think particularly when it comes to looking at experience, Marshall McLuhan talked about many companies spend a lot of time communicating information. Unfortunately, it doesn't drive behavior, and it's recognizing the parts of our brain, and Roger can certainly speak to this, the parts of our brain that actually create, drive behavior in people. And we look at two primary levers when we look at companies, and we're trying to make a company successful. The first one is differentiation. Many companies spend a lot of time, many CEOs develop products and then turn around and deliver them the way that their peers do. And unfortunately, customers don't see a difference, so it tends to commoditize their product. So we look at differentiation as one key piece, and the other part is the emotional connection. Experience is about making things that people feel, and I think it's creating things that matter and delivering it in ways that matter to them. But the emotional connection is really where you start to drive passion and loyalty and all of those things that ultimately connect people with other companies, other people. So I think there is a real value to understanding experience in those terms.
And if I jump on to that, the concept that comes to my mind is differentiating between relationship and relatedness. And relationship implies a connection. It implies emotion. It implies responsibility. It implies commitment. Relatedness is, so classic is that I don't have a relationship with Joe Biden, but I have a connectedness. He is the president of the United States. I'm an American. But the point in this is, if we're really going to get to the emotional side, we have to connect in a relationship, not just relatedness. And often companies make the mistake of focusing just on the product and just pushing it without really connecting to how does that resonate with me? How do I respond to it? Is it a dialogue or is it a monologue?
And I think, Roger, and also Tim, is it a commitment? Because a relationship, even of the most superficial sort, involves trust and commitment and a willingness to engage in real, authentic conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do you have sort of top of mind the list of the enterprises that you would suggest actually are willing to make a commitment? I mean, I could give you top of mind of, friends of mine who are trying to get their identities back, who find that most corporations only have $10,000 worth of liability to help you with that, and are pretty singularly unhelpful in terms of making it happen. I could give you experiences of banks who have been absolutely operating within the limits of the law and have managed to savage people. So, by the way, I just want to say I am a champion of enterprise systems, and I'm a big institutionalist. I think we need laws, we need institutions, and we certainly need enterprise that's entering the 21st century. And we all live in a world where some of enterprise leaders seem to be living in the last century. And they are absolutely managing as if they have no commitment to their customers except the transactional one. Mm-hmm. So is there something in your experience as a psychologist and as a designer that could help the people on this call work with that dynamic rather than simply assume that it isn't there? People are stuck for whatever reasons in systems that are influencing their behavior, and they may be very good parents and wonderful partners. But once they get into that relationship of the enterprise, ching, ching, the cash register needs to ring every quarter.
So immediately what comes to my mind is, Mary, is that it has to begin within the system. So I don't think you can have a company that's wanting to build a relationship with its customers if it hasn't already decided to build a relationship with its employees and to respond to them and respect to them and engage in a dialogue. And I know, for some reason I'm having a senior moment, but I've had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with the former CEO of Unilever, and it's just currently out of my mind.
Paul Pullman.
Paul Pullman, yeah. Thank you. And Paul was passionate about this, not only about making a difference in the world, but also applying it internally. Was he successful 100% of the time? No. But did people, and I've known a number of Unilever employees, but people felt like he really was committed and was trying. Mm-hmm. And you get a lot of credit for trying and being open and wanting to listen and believing that you can learn.
I think that's so important to say, Roger, because none of us is personally perfect, right? At least I'm not. By the way, I refer to those senior moments as seasoned moments. It works very very well for me. So we can't sacrifice the good for the perfect. We know that everybody is learning all the time. And I think Unilever is a very, very good example of that. We had a speaker from Colgate very recently, and they are also the president of Colgate, of Unilever North America, was once at Colgate. So there are good people out there earnestly attempting to shift things. It's just, can we shift it in a decade? If we believe what's the science and the UN Sustainable Development Goals are telling us, we have 10 years to see if we can avoid this iceberg.
Yeah, I'd like to add also one thing that we were sort of talking about here with what is the core element that's going to impact what we're doing. It doesn't mean that you trade off these objectives for for making money. So this is our 23rd year working with Apple. We worked 12 years with Steve when he was back at the company. They went from 2 billion to 2 trillion, so they've had decent revenue stream. But the thing that he consistently reminded us of, that any brand, any great brand, is about trust. And the things that we've seen in creating a good experience around that, the research tells us we're going to have 6 times more lift if we create a positive brand experience for people. We're going to have 12 times the level of advocacy, meaning other people saying good things about your brand. But the other part, which we mentioned, is you're going to have 5 times more likely to forgive a mistake when you make one. And Apple has certainly made their share of mistakes as well. So it's a recognition that building a strong connection through experience creates value not only on the sales and transactions and revenue side of the equation, but it also builds a very strong supportive community. And I think that's a key piece of this equation when you look at where the value is created for them.
And trust depends on a relationship.
Yeah, goes back to that.
It does, and so and the interesting thing is you can have a relationship with a corporation. I feel like, I happen to be an Apple fan, and it's amazing to walk into. Last year, I was in Singapore. I had trouble with my computer. I went to the Apple store. There were like 20 or 30 people just sitting on the floor working. But they liked the amp. Nobody came and said, are you going to buy something or you're not going to buy? And Apple, I think, really does understand the relationship.
Roger, I think that's quite true, what both you and Tim said. So let me hit you with a hard question, if you don't mind, because I think most of the people on this call have had that experience where we walk into a place which has a trust value for us, and we're well treated because at some point along the line, we're pretty well scrubbed up. We look like we might become good customers. So I'm going to push just a little bit here and say, how do we extend that? Because I know, Tim, this has been a very important part of what you've spoken about. How do we extend that largesse to people who are not so well scrubbed up, who are up against it? And those could be people who used to have a 5 heating zone house in California till the fires came. It could be anyone. So we're not just talking about, somebody somewhere we can imagine. We're talking about people we know who have had to flee from recent events. How do we really design for equity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of doing the part that you can. It makes it very difficult. There's not going to be sort of one solution. I think you start with what we call value creation engine, which is you start with human outcomes. If you structure an approach to any problem around the human outcomes, in our experience, about the economic outcomes tend to follow. But without starting at human outcome level, it's hard to rationalize a strategy that you're going to have that's going to be successful, and then from that develop the tactics that will support the strategy. So we tend to put the questions or the considerations into those three buckets, but all of them ladder up to the human outcome. And I think whether whether you're looking at solving a housing problem or whether you're looking at solving a FMCG problem, you can look at banking. It doesn't matter if you're focused on human outcomes to begin with, and your strategy supports that, and then the tactics you create the strategy. You're going to have the best chance at building a meaningful relationship and ultimately creating value.
Thank you. Roger, any insights from the world of psychology, where we know that old reptile brain likes to make differentiations that are not so positive?
Yeah. I suppose again, it's fascinating. I love these kind of conversations because what comes to my mind is to a certain degree, it's building self-awareness, other awareness, having the capacity, which I think initially came from Ron Heifetz, of getting off the dance floor and up to the balcony and being able to get perspective and think about what are we really doing and how are we doing it, and engaging that in that conversation, both internally and externally. Feedback, and really listening. And I know it's idealistic, but I also know that there are companies that are struggling to make the difference, and so I think it's looking at those role models out there that really are trying to do that.
Yeah, and I want to keep consistent with my promise to move the rest of the group into the conversation. So I'm going to indulge myself with one more question, if I may. And Roger, this to you, but Tim, possibly you too. I noticed in your biography that you work with family enterprise systems as well. And that's a space that I think is exploring. There's a book that we use in one part of our program that deals specifically with family enterprise, because they're closer to that dance floor balcony relationship that you talk about. They seem to move back and forth because they often live in the communities that they service, and people know where they actually live if they don't do them right. So do you find a difference between family enterprise systems Ralph Lauren is a family enterprise system. I've worked for them. Most businesses start off that way, but do you find a difference between family enterprise and, let's say, a big company like GE?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is because there are some very large family enterprises. Again, it's a seasoned moment. But what is in Minnesota, the large grain and production, whatever. But the other one that comes to mind, mine is Patagonia, who really, really try desperately to live their values. And when you are hired at Patagonia, one of the questions they ask you is, what are you committed to do to make a difference in the world? And you need to have a project. And so I think, I think we have to look at the companies that are really living this. And obviously Patagonia gets rewarded for it.
Thank you. Tim, anything about that? You don't need to.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work, particularly here in Asia, with family offices. So many of the countries in this region, are run by a handful of family offices. So they tend to have lots of ecosystems that they're in the business of creating and operating. And so finding the ones who are ultimately looking to have better impact on the environment, or have a more effective supply chain, or really transforming types of experience that people have with them, that's fairly common in what I would say in the Southeast Asia region. And so less so much of the large single corporation, but it's it's something that we've seen. There are those who are making a very proactive impact, and from what I've seen, many of them, because in a way we're sort of moving into a second generation, if you will, from those who have made a lot of money in sort of the conventional means. Now the children of that generation are starting to take over these companies, and they want a world much different than the one that maybe their parents were involved in shaping. And so it's interesting to see how they're taking on much more I think responsibility, more of a sense of social and environmental values. And so you starting to see a pretty significant change. And this is all billionaire families. These are people who are going to have influence in the region.
And that is a big difference between family business and a large multinational publicly traded, because family businesses have the second and third or whatever generations saying, hey, wait a minute, and calling up, which in a way that it doesn't happen in publicly traded companies or family businesses.
Yeah, that closeness to the dance floor and the balcony really makes a difference. I think we're going to need some structural rethinking, some new designs, Tim, for the way we actually bring things to market. Thank you both very much. I'm going to go to the chat. So for those of you who would like to put your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand or some kind of signal on Zoom, and I will, you're getting a lot of thanks. All design has changed. Snow has said thank you to both of you. Anybody have a question? Amber, I can see your mouth moving.
I do. So thank you, Robert and the team, for your wonderful experience. I am graduating from design management this month, and I'm eager to know that for a younger generation that to be honest, I don't really have experience in corporation, and I'm also wanted to do my own business within design and the new material. Do you have any sort of recommendation, or where you see the opportunity we can apply what you talk about, the changes to the relationship with the customer that I wanted to build relationship with, like how our younger generation can apply that in our very, very small business?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that you have an opportunity because of your perspective. And one of the most interesting things that we've seen with many companies these days is there was a time when they were focusing on sort of the Gen Y consumer. And what's interesting about Gen Y and everybody older than that is, we remember a pre and a post iPhone world. And I think that's a unique point in time. But younger people today don't have the same fascination with the technology in the same way as people who are maybe 30 and above. And so I think that when you look at digital natives, the idea of it being a ubiquitous kind of technology service starts to imply completely new and different opportunities to connect with one another. And I think it's very hard for the older generation to understand that, because they've grown up with that transition. And so I think there's a huge competitive advantage for you potentially to start to think about how can you bring your generational perspective to the conversation, because we're at a really pretty big transition within culture, and you might be one of the early ones in this next generation to have the kind of visibility to that to have impact.
Thank you, Tim. Anybody else have a question? This is not usually a quiet crowd.
I think Stephen has raised his hand, and then Bill as well.
Okay, Stephen, go for it.
Yeah, I'd like Tim and Roger to elucidate a little bit more about what we talked about early in the conversation about the difference between product and brand. And that dichotomy, sometimes if you've got excellent brand perception, how does that impact the product perception that company or brand provides, and then vice versa, depending upon whether or not there's positive or negative perceptions on both of those elements.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that you know we talked about trust being a core thing for any brand, but your product is just one touch point. You know, if you think about how we maybe understand Apple or other companies, you understand their products and services. You understand maybe their retail stores and the touch points that are there. You understand the different forms of communication. You understand the human-to-human behavior that you have when you interact with somebody from the company. If you think of all of those as holistic expressions of your value system, they're all ultimately, all of those touch points are how people are going to understand you. And I think that when you make a product, you can make a product that's fantastic, and you can make one that's a mistake. But if you still represent those values and you respond accordingly, you tend to build a positive outcome even out of an error. But you know, you have to recognize that it's just one of many touch points, and that if you're looking at building a relationship, it's different than if you're trying to sell that individual product. And you know, products will come and go. Some will be more successful than others, but I think it is ultimately an expression of the values you stand for, then being manifested in the touch points you create.
Thank you. Bill?
First of all, Mary, wonderful to see you. This is Bill Schiffner, class of 2005. Wonderful to see
Bill. Bill, I remember you very well. You don't have to wear your year. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Mary. And hello, everyone. I was with Apple for 10 years. I was their accessibility advocate. And I will say this, first and foremost, is why? Why are we doing what we're doing through the product and services that we provide? If we don't know why bother? And so everything that's being discussed here may be brand, product, services. At the end of the day, it's all about the human experience. Are you getting the experience that you're looking for, where you're willing to spend the money, spend your time, spend anything that is valuable with a company like Apple and others? And internally and externally, if you don't answer the why, then the company will crumble, will fall apart, will grow disconnected. Especially now, in the days that we're all together in Zoom, and most companies are working in Zoom, while we're communicating, we're not really communicating. We're not able to really see each other. And because we're looking for that human connection, getting back to a question that you asked earlier, Mary, about what can companies do to make it better, just start by asking, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
How are you feeling?
Yeah.
You know, you got systems and you got all these other departments and you have bureaucracy, but just starting with the fundamental of how you doing. And when you give somebody the opportunity to talk and you truly listen, then you can go, aha, let's see what we can do to go forward from there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, Bill. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, it's so funny you should say that. Bill Snow, who's on this call, brought it to my attention as we entered Zoom land. Mary, have you noticed that people have stopped asking, how are you doing? And they started asking, how are you feeling? And I realize sometimes it can be a subtle distinction, but I think we are more aware now that we're disembodied spirits on thumbnails, and we have to find our way to each other in different ways. So thanks for that question. Anybody else? Chinos has a question. Let's start. He's saying, thank you, Tim and Roger. Very insightful conversation. Chinos, why don't you just ask your question?
Right. Okay, thanks. I'll just go ahead and read it again. So a lot of what you shared is super insightful and exciting. I think it's just so overwhelming. You have experience, but for a younger person coming up in their organization, how would you suggest that they could initiate buy-in from the right stakeholders within their organization? Now, you did mention that, you know, some are small family offices or bigger corporations, depending on the organization. How would you suggest or advise one to kind of initiate that buy-in from the right stakeholders so that they could implement that idea of the return experience? I mean, it's something very valuable. And how would you say you can get people, maybe in an organization that have more power or voice, how would you get them to buy into that value of it?
I guess I would say that many of the companies that we're familiar with working with, their leadership understands the value of the experience they're creating, and so in some cases, if we're coming into an organization at a lower level, a line manager level, that sort of thing, it's hard because they're already locked into a vertical that's one piece of a number of things. If you're talking at the C level, they tend to see where the elements are coming together, and therefore it's, in a way, we found it easier to sell to a CEO than someone who's managing a particular discipline within a company. In fact, it's much harder to have that access and have the ability to speak to them at that level. But one of the things we've found is you can come in to a very large company. We've done this in the past with companies where we don't have access to the CEO, and you demonstrate the difference of what a successful outcome looks like. And so pick a small battle and win that battle, and they will notice. We helped launch the Lincoln brand in China, and because it was China and North America really wasn't looking that closely at it, we were able to try some things that they wouldn't have done in other markets. Now the new CEO, the new head of digital, and head of marketing are all three people who came out of the China work that we had done, and they've all been promoted within Ford. So I think you come in and you do what you can. You get a foot in the door. You get a handhold on the face of the cliff, and you start climbing. But you can go in and make an impact that will be recognized by people. And I think it takes work. It takes some determination. It takes really learning your craft well enough to where you have a clear understanding of what you're trying to do. If you're still experimenting in things, it makes it harder to be successful, but you just recognize you're in that phase of a career. But I would say go get a small win, and don't give up. Stay at it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for some. I guess it's more than advice; it's wisdom for people on the call who are really in the experimental phase. And whenever you make a transition, I mean, if Roger were to do something else and Tim were to do something else, they would be in transitional phases too. So it's not just age specific. So in that transitional phase, enjoy it, because as frustrating as it may be not to have the access that these two fellows have, you have something else to bring to an organization, including your ignorance, which is not a bad thing sometimes if you don't understand it. Maybe neither does the customer. So leverage what you have. Tim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that point, which is really, if you take the approach of kind of lifelong learning, when you graduate, you're not done. When you get to Roger and I's age, you're not done. Just that notion that you have a continuous learning mentality is, I think, a really healthy thing. And it also gives you a reason to get out of bed every day. There's always something new to encounter. So I think you go make the most of it. I think it's very critical to have that point of view.
And I think again, also along with that is going in and in an appropriate way asking questions and inviting others to ask questions and to think about, what are we doing? How could we do it differently? What are we not doing? What are we missing? And I say in an appropriate way, so that because the system can very quickly become defensive as well. But I think it creates a fantastic opportunity to come in and say, Let me add some observations that I've had.
Yeah, I think, Roger, you raise a sensitive point, especially when we talk about people who are coming into the new enterprise workforce. And that is, there's a difference between a question and a demand.
Yes.
And there are times when demands are absolutely worthy and necessary, and that doesn't mean that they'll be heard. So developing the art of the question, as Roger is suggesting, is so important at every stage of our life as learners, because it's so easy to walk in. I'm sure you can feel this way, Roger and Tim, that it's so easy to be smug when you walk into an organization. It's not like you haven't seen one before. And yet, whenever we walk into an organization, we're walking into another organization, not the same one we left yesterday. Yeah. I have does anybody else have a question?
The question.
No.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for bridging it to my question. And I'll try my best to frame it because I have so many highlights from our conversation, and I think that will lead to my question. I like it so much when you bring the perspective of value into this discussion, because I feel as a human being and a customer, sometimes we don't know what we want, and also that change across time. And when you say that all design needs change and design help people navigate and adapt to that change, I think that's brilliant because 20, 30 years ago, what we desire is maybe different from what we want today. And as a leading and a design leader, have you encountered questions like when you present a solution that we think that will deliver a better human outcomes, somehow the client or more conservative group will say that that's too ideal or audacious? And because when we design for change, it is a product change, habit change, customer behavior change, and also organizational change and innovation. And it's overwhelming to manage so much changes all at once. And as a design leader and a person who wants to live as if life matters, how would you manage your working process, design process to navigate that changes?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a couple examples. One is in banking and finance. It's a very dry subject. Probably the most conservative industry that we've encountered, at least. And there's inherent resistance to change, and so starting out with that strategy of taking on small victories and being able to demonstrate value within particularly the larger organizations or the more conservative ones has been a strategy that's worked well for us. The other ones are sort of complete workarounds. If you look at Tesla, when Tesla started to sell electric cars, it was very difficult because the traditional dealers didn't want anything to do with them. They wanted to stop the electric cars because they had a business in internal combustion engines, and so they wouldn't let Tesla in the market effectively. And so we said, well, you don't need the dealers, and why don't you put a small showroom in a shopping center and buy everything online, and then you have a workaround with some of the legal restrictions that exist in certain states. So that approach was saying, well, if you can't beat them, work around them, and the other one was come in and take small victories and try to turn the ship, because in many organizations, big companies in particular, if you don't have the ear of the CEO, then making that change is a process. It takes some patience. It's going to take some frustration, but also if you're aligned around what you believe you're doing is the right thing, then you should push for what you believe. And I think we've seen many leaders come and engage you because they believe that you passionately believe in what you're doing, and they may or may not agree, but they're always looking for that person who has that kind of drive and desire. So anyway, those are a couple examples. Roger, you may have some other examples.
not necessarily, well, there are examples, but what comes, again, the concept that comes to my mind from looking at this from a systems perspective is that whenever you're coming in with something new, you're going to meet resistance. There's almost always going to be resistance at some level. And there is a concept that phenomenally is not well known and is not talked about in business school or in almost any system, but I'm sure that Mary and Maren talk about it, which is social defenses, which is how teams and organizations organize themselves to deal with what they perceive as a threat. And so the task that you have is to be able to recognize when you're a threat and disarm it or take a different tact. Because if you don't address that, you're not going to go forward. And a lot of the dialogue that Tim and I have had is understanding the defensive behavior of the executives, the management team, or the people who are making the decisions, because they're afraid. They're afraid of making a mistake, of making the wrong decision, of betting the farm or whatever. And your task is to create, to recognize that and to address it. If you don't address it, you will be blocked.
Yeah. And we've used that argument of well, it's risky. We've used that as, yes, it's risky to try something new, but it's risky to not try something new as well. And if we're living at a time where the rate of change is so fast, that to not be trying something that embodies some risk is very dangerous for companies. And so you're as likely to be put out of business by status quo thinking as opposed to going out and experimenting and trying things. At the first Apple store, we received all kinds of feedback about what a mistake it was going to be. And I think today it's hard to imagine the brand without the retail program. But it was by Steve considered risky. The night we opened the first store, and today, the real risk would have been listening to the pundits and not doing the program.
Tim, I was purposely not going to ask you about the first Apple store because it's like asking a band to sing that old classic again. But since you've gone there, I do have a question about related to that. I thought your design was just genius, by the way. And I think it so anticipated a world where transparency would become one of the words that we talk about the most, transparency on every level in institutional systems. Do you think that's happening? Roger and Tim, do you see more transparent organizations? I mean, clearly organizations are getting better at doing analytical research on their customers and doing business and having business intelligence about that. But how socially defensive are organizations about being more transparent so that we can actually help and they can actually help and we can achieve what it is that you're both striving for, which is better human outcomes? Do you see that happening, the transparency?
Roger, you want to start or I can?
So yes and no. I do think that this is the conversations that I have with leadership is that it's more a topic. It's still a long way to go, but but I do think that it's on the radar screen, certainly more than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so I'm an optimist. But also, I am an unabashed optimist.
That's the next book.
And I think the market is demanding that as well. And that's something I think Tim can speak to. But I think the market is going to demand more and more of that transparency.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing it in a way with maybe companies that have, again, maybe I don't know if it's a more modern mindset, but that idea of transparency and exchange being part of their value system. There's a company in China called Xiaomi that we work with. They make 2,000 electronics products, etc. But what's particularly interesting about them is they have what are called Mi fans, which are their fan base of loyal customers. They have 50 million people who are on their fan base. And what Xiaomi does is they design a product, they put out some beautiful renderings and videos and things like that, and they put it out into their fan base. And in looking at it through their fan base, people make comments, they give feedback, they like it, they don't like it. What it does is it gives Xiaomi an extraordinary competitive advantage because they know before they spend a penny on the tooling, before they do any of the engineering, they've got a potential product that's going to be successful or not, and they have to go back to the drawing board. But they use that transparency as a way of refining their intelligence and then being able to deliver a better product. And so those companies who again have a dialogue versus a monologue with brands are the ones who are going to be reaping the most benefits.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question?
There's one.
Yeah? Clinton
has.
How's everybody doing?
Okay.
Good. I've just been listening in, and what you just what you just hit on there. I work in a small manufacturing company, and I'm the sole creative in this company. And I've been trying to work with more influencers, like social media influencers. I was wondering if you could kind of speak on how building a brand or trying to strengthen your brand using those kind of influencers. What's your take on that?
Well, from our side, we've seen the influence on companies from influencers being influencing both the product development as well as obviously their marketing and channel strategy and access. So what's interesting is they tend to sort of emerge and disappear. Some stay around for a long period of time, but it's interesting to kind of see how that can influence product development. Not only the marketing side, but also what is their perception of things that create value for the people you're trying to connect with. It's important to ensure that the influencers actually align with whoever your target audience may be that you're providing your products and services for. But we've seen that particularly in I would say more in fashion and other sectors where a certain degree of sense of style or a particular kind of look that people are going after. It's been more successful in those sectors, but not exclusively. You don't see it a whole lot in banking and finance, but you do see it in
Sure.
Products here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we want to see it in banking and finance, to be perfectly honest.
Certainly.
Thank you for that question, Clinton. Well, I'm going to make a recommendation that your next book be Unabashed Optimism, a Conversation. And we'll be right here when it is that you want to present it. And I'm going to do this one more time because these guys are modest. This is the book, Return on Experience. I strongly suggest you take a look at it, more than a look at it. And Roger and Tim, what a delight. And everybody else on this call too, thank you. I know some of you are in your pajamas at different places in the world, and that's why I'm not seeing your faces, but I know you're there. And I'm very grateful that you joined us for this conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Roger and Tim, I told you we're stalkers, beware. Thank you so much.
Okay, Mary, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Joining us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.